So I'd like this morning to try to set the stage for the rest of the discussion, but really talking about the clinical side of liver transplantation as it relates to alcohol use. Disclosure that I'm a transplant surgeon as well as the medical director of Transplant Quebec on the transplantation side, and I've taken a few honoraria in primarily the oncologic areas not related to this talk. I thought I'd begin by talking about or introducing the beginnings of liver transplantation. And on the screen, you see two of the pioneers of liver transplantation. On the left, Dr. Thomas Starzl, and in the center, Sir Roy Kahn, who are the surgeons who really pioneered the techniques of liver transplantation in the early 60s. Unfortunately, their initial efforts ended in failure. And so voluntarily, the transplant community chose to suspend transplantation because of these early deaths. And these early deaths were related primarily to bleeding, uncontrolled bleeding from the critically ill cirrhotic patients, as well as to rejection and sepsis in the postoperative period. The modern era of transplantation began five or 10 years later with reliant on two things. One was the introduction of new and effective immunosuppression, and the second was refinement of the surgical technique. And really, the modern era of transplantation, not just liver transplantation, but transplantation in general, only took off in the 1980s with the introduction of the calcineurin inhibitors. Roy Kahn published on the first series of successful human liver transplants, and he talked about the criteria that would make someone valid or eligible for a transplant. And these were basically the patients who did not have terrible cirrhosis. And so patients who we could get technically through the surgery were the ones who were targeted. And this excluded, initially at least, patients suffering from alcoholic cirrhosis and focused more on patients with primary hepatic or biliary tract carcinoma and other congenital abnormalities of the liver and biliary tree. Over time, of course, this has changed. And this is data from the SRTR, which is the major transplant registry in the United States, showing how over the last decade or so, not only has the number of liver transplants been steadily increasing, but the diagnosis for which liver transplant is performed have also changed. And we see in the purple line an increase over the last 5 years or so in the incidence of alcoholic liver disease as an indication for liver transplantation. And that's accompanied by a precipitous decline in the incidence of hepatitis C as an indication for liver transplantation. This is, of course, due to the new antiviral therapies that we have for this disease. The other increase is most likely due to the epidemic of morbid obesity, where NASH cirrhosis is now becoming one of the primary indications for liver transplantation. This next graph shows the SRTR data on really very gross survival curves by diagnosis. And we can see that regardless of diagnosis, we've been able to achieve really very excellent 5-year survivals after liver transplantation, just over or hovering around 80%, and that the group who are transplanted for alcoholic liver disease are among the best survivors in the post-transplant area. In Canada, the data that we have isn't quite as nicely presented, but this is a look at 2 decades of liver transplantation, looking at first the decade from 2000 to 2009, where we see that hepatitis C was the primary indication for liver transplant, and about 1/4 of all transplants being performed during that decade were for hepatitis C related problems, with alcohol cirrhosis being the second or third most common indication. In the subsequent decade, 2010 to 2019, we see that hepatitis C, as in the United States, has dropped off dramatically, where cancer indications have increased over time. Alcohol as an indication has also increased, but not yet to the same extent as is seen in the United States. Overall, in Canada, the total number of liver transplants that we perform over the last 10, 15 years has increased steadily, but not very, very precipitously. As of 2019, there were 606 liver transplants performed in the country, and of those, that includes, both the living and deceased donor liver transplants. Similarly, the wait list, so the number of patients who are waiting for a liver transplant, hasn't changed that dramatically over the last 10 years either. What also hasn't changed, unfortunately, is that every year there are patients who die while waiting for the liver transplants. And in 2019, that number is around 250. So we have a situation where the need for livers far outstrips the available supply. And so we are forced to allocate, to make decisions about who will be eligible for liver transplant and in what priority we have to give them. This is drawn from the OPTN, the agency that oversees the allocation of organs in the United States, and their principles around organ allocation. And there are a few that we highlight based on sound medical judgment, best use of the organs, to avoid wasting organs, to avoid futile transplants, and to promote access and effective organ placement. In Canada, we don't have a national agency that oversees in the same sort of regulatory way that the OPTN and UNOS do in the United States. Nonetheless, we do have national groups that meet to discuss how we're going to prioritize patients on our waitlist and allow access to liver transplant. In the liver transplant community, the most recent forum like this was held in 2016. And these are some extracts from the principles that were applied during that discussion, that forum. So we wanted to ensure prioritization based on medical need, on utility, to balance the competing principles to ensure fair access, equitable access. There's a Canadian decision to prioritize children over adults, absolutely. We acknowledge that there is a demand that outstrips the supply, and therefore that we are going to have to make choices about who on the waiting list will receive a liver, and that the ethical considerations are definitely going to impact these policies. So how do we allocate livers in Canada? Well, historically, we've looked at a very gross classification of systems where patients would be prioritized based on basically where they were and how sick they were at that moment. So those patients who were in fulminant liver failure, intubated in an ICU, received priority over those patients who were in the ICU but not yet intubated, and the patients in the ICU received priority over the patients who were in hospital but not in an ICU, over those who were at home, and the patients with a cancer diagnosis were prioritized slightly ahead of those who were at home with other diagnoses. And time on the wait list therefore became the tiebreaker for most of these things. Gradually, we shifted toward a more objective assessment, something called the MELD score, and the Mayo End Stage for Liver Disease score, which predicts mortality of patients with cirrhosis. Basically, the higher your score, the more likely you are to die in the next year, and therefore the higher your priority on the wait list. This score, although more objective, isn't perfect, and there are certain conditions for which we frequently do liver transplants that are not considered by the score, and so accompanying the MELD score, there has to be some kind of an arbitrary system which allows us to add priority to patients for certain diagnoses, particularly for cancers, things like hepatopulmonary syndrome, etc. The other principle that we've used in Canada is that for any diagnosis that we want to seek an indication for liver transplant, we want to ensure that we're using the organs well, and that therefore the 5-year survival, we've put a threshold at around 50 to 60%. But again, we're basically working on a sickest patient first prioritization. The actual rules and the listing criteria do vary a little bit from one province to the other in their details, but the principles are very much the same across the country. We have a couple of national groups in the liver transplant community that have been meeting since liver transplants began to discuss these policies at a national level. There's the Canadian Liver Transplant Network, or the Canadian Liver Transplant Group, who've been meeting since the 1990s regularly to review these things. The CCDT has been involved, and this has also been taken on by Canadian Blood Services, or CBS, through the Liver Transplant Advisory Group. So the early guidance documents put together by the CLTG at the time covered the topics that were considered controversial indications for liver transplant. And at the time, as we didn't have very good treatments for hepatitis B, that was one of the ones that was considered: alcohol abuse, liver tumors of different kinds and stages, transplantation of foreign nationals, and how we would prioritize the fulminant liver failure and share nationally for that. But discussions over time have focused on a variety of topics: retransplantation for hepatitis C before we had access to antiviral therapy, implementing the MELD score, which I mentioned before, how we share livers across the country, specific protocols for certain kinds of cancers, pediatric listing, criteria around sarcopenia and obesity, which we know have impacts on outcome after transplant, and alcoholic hepatitis quite recently. The principles of these discussions, again, have been focused on utility and avoiding futility, a minimum threshold for 5-year survival. And the liver transplant community really views itself as stewards of this very scarce resource, which we want to ensure are well used. In reality, though, every day in every one of the adult liver transplant programs, patients are excluded from liver transplantation. There was a time when we didn't do retransplantation for patients with recurrent hepatitis C. When we had tumors that are outside of the accepted criteria for listing, these patients too were excluded from the list. Patients whose medical condition makes them unlikely to survive a transplant are excluded as well. And then there's psychosocial factors that are routinely used, not just in liver transplantation, but in transplantation in general: lack of compliance, lack of social support, and ongoing active substance abuse in some cases. This brings us to alcohol use in liver transplantation. So the 6-month abstinence rule has been in place basically since widespread liver transplantation began. In Canada, it was endorsed by the CLTG in the 90s and then reaffirmed in 2011. It was also endorsed and widely recommended across the United States by associations such as the AASLD, the American Association for the Study of Liver Diseases, which is the preeminent hepatology society. And there are many rationales for that. Some are historical. The first published series of liver transplants leading into the early 1980s really showed inferior survival initially and outcomes for those patients transferred for alcohol use disorder. And that the history of that, I think, clouds or hangs over the liver transplant community still to this day. The rationales for the 6-month rule included the observation that if you have cirrhosis that is decompensated and stop drinking, then after a period of abstinence, liver function may recover and actually obviate the need for liver transplantation. You recover to a point where you no longer require liver transplant as long as you remain abstinent. In several studies, we had seen that a period of prolonged abstinence pre-transplant decreases the likelihood of a risk to return to problem drinking after transplant. We know also from long-term follow-up that return to problem drinking post-transplant does lead to worse outcomes. A 6-month rule or a 3-month rule, a 12-month rule, an arbitrary rule like this is clear, it's easy to apply, and as I showed before, we've achieved excellent clinical outcomes by applying this rule. Just to comment on the outcomes of liver transplantation for alcoholic liver disease, this graph shows the survival curves of patients with without return to drinking, with return to drinking but without cirrhosis, and then with return to drinking and recurrent cirrhosis. We know that while waiting for transplantation, up to 25% of patients, when you monitor for it, will actually be drinking while waiting for the liver transplant. And post-transplant, depending on how you define it, at least 15 to 20% of patients do return to drinking and even heavy drinking. The problem with that is that the natural history of progression to cirrhosis after liver transplant is different than before. Whereas it may take 20 years to become cirrhotic through heavy drinking before liver transplant, the transplanted liver is more sensitive to this, and recurrent cirrhosis can occur as quickly as within 5 years. What's interesting on the survival curve to note is that really out to 5 years, there is no major difference in survival between these different groups. When we get into longer term survival in the 10 and 15-year range, we really see that the 3 groups split apart. So we know that the later outcomes for liver transplant for patients with alcoholic liver disease who return to drinking are far inferior to those of other patients. The community, both at large and the medical community, have always had or have maintained a stigma around alcohol use disorders. And these were certainly initially viewed as self-inflicted diseases. But I think that understanding around this is changing, and that this is really being recognized more and more as a medical disease that can respond to treatment. So this is one thing that comes to color the discussion. there have been reports of early liver transplantation in the condition of acute alcoholic hepatitis, where there is no option or no period of abstinence with excellent outcomes. And this has also come to tinge the discussions around transplantation for alcohol-related liver disease. And in addition, there have been several challenges by patients and their families of cases where patients who were turned down for liver transplantation based on a 6-month abstinence rule. And these challenges have received not only heavy media coverage, but actual legal challenges, which we'll hear about later in this panel. So there's a changing landscape around the way alcoholic liver disease and liver transplantation are viewed. In Ontario, the 2 adult programs, in conjunction with the ODO Trillium Gift of Life, initiated a pilot project to identify patients with alcoholic liver disease who would not be eligible for liver transplantation under the current 6-month rule, or what was then the 6-month rule, but may yet benefit from a liver transplant. This protocol was engineered around treatment for the underlying alcohol use disorder, with monitoring for adherence and rapid institution of therapy in the event of relapse. Other provinces in British Columbia and Alberta have also established alternate pathways to transplantation and no longer use the absolute requirement for the 6-month rule. So whereas in 2010, 2013, there was really uniform application of the 6-month rule across the country, there are now jurisdictions where it is not so rigidly applied. In light of this, CBS and CLTN are together working on a leading practice on alcohol use in liver transplantation. And our goal is to create an evidence-based national policy on this issue. And this is a process which, like any leading practice, is going to involve or is involving a comprehensive literature review, extensive stakeholder engagement, environmental scan, and hopefully a forum much like this one, or maybe even one in face-to-face in the spring of 2022. So I'd like to thank you very much for the invitation, for your attention, and we'll be happy to entertain your questions at the end of this panel.
Thank you very much. Just a reminder to please do put your questions into the Q&A. We'll have lots of times for questions at the end of the panel. So our next speaker is Dr. Susan Abbey. Dr. Abbey is a Psychiatrist-in-Chief, the University Health Network, and a professor of psychiatry at the University of Toronto. Dr. Abbey.
Thank you very much. There we go. So I've been asked today to talk about alcohol use disorder treatment options and efficacy. So I've got no financial disclosures. I've been a transplant psychiatrist. I started actually my residency almost 30 years, and it's an area that I adore and is endlessly fascinating and endless new challenges. So I'm going to talk about 3 things really today. I'm going to talk a little bit about what is alcohol use disorder and how does that differ from heavy drinking or people that potentially just use a lot of alcohol in day-to-day life, why that matters following liver transplantation, and then what we can do in terms of treatment options and efficacy. And I'll share the surprising news at the start that sadly we don't know a lot about that, so we're extrapolating from some other areas. So let's turn to this question of what is alcohol use disorder and how do we understand it. Well, this is Canada's low-risk drinking guidelines, and you can see the drinks here, so that we use something called standard drinks to help understand across different things that you can drink with alcohol in them, depending on what their alcohol content is, how much you have to drink. So 12 ounces of beer is a standard drink, 12 ounces of cider or a cooler is a standard drink, 5 ounces of alcohol, and only 1.5 ounces of spirits. So based on that, men should not be drinking more than 15 drinks a week with no more than 3 drinks a day. And women should not be drinking more than 10 drinks a week for women with no more than 2 drinks a day. And there's the recommendation that everybody should be planning non-drinking days, that if there's a pattern of daily drinking, that's likely to run you into more trouble more quickly. And this is really to reduce long-term health risks. we look at the epidemiology of alcohol use in Canada, probably almost a quarter of the population are completely abstinent. They don't drink. About 65–70% are classified as moderate drinkers. Problem drinkers would be in the range of around 7%. And these are point prevalence, and alcohol use disorders about 2% of the population. But the most recent study in the fall of 2017 suggests that up to 18% of the population will meet criteria for an alcohol use disorder over their entire lifetime. So these are criteria that come from the American Psychiatric Association Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 5. There are 11 criteria that we ask about, and they're really grouped into 4 major categories. So you can see in blue, I've got the symptoms around impaired control over alcohol use. In the sort of light red, the social impairment from ongoing use. Green is risky use, and pharmacologic. So if we look at impaired control, if you're using larger amounts of alcohol than you intend to, or you're using over longer periods than you intend to. If you really think about, you want to cut down, or you make repeated efforts to cut down. If you're spending a lot of time using it or recovering from use. So some of the folks I'll see will say, well, they do their day job and then they go home and they literally drink from like 5 p.m. through till midnight. And so they're no longer going to their kids' baseball games. They don't spend any time with their partners. All they can do is work. Craving to use. If we go on to the social impairment, and you can see there's sort of overlap in some of them, but really you're not able to fulfill your major role obligations at work, school, or home. You're continuing to use despite interpersonal problems that are either caused by the alcohol or exacerbated by it, or you're giving up or missing out on kind of really key activities. Risky use is you're continuing to use despite psychological or physical problems secondary to the alcohol. So sometimes in assessing people, we see people who have been diagnosed 10 years ago with significant liver disease, and they have continued to use despite that. One poor guy I saw a couple of weeks ago said, I keep intending to stop next week. And, sadly has not. And use in physically hazardous situations. So the most common thing that we think about are driving while impaired or driving under the influence charges, but people do lots of, I saw a couple of weeks ago, a roofer who, was getting up on roofs drunk. And then pharmacologically tolerant. So that means that you either need markedly increased amounts to achieve the desired effect. As one woman said to me last week, I started off with a shot of vodka. And I said, where did you end up? And she said, well, have you heard of a Texas Mickey? And I hadn't, and looked it up, and it was actually 3,000 milliliters. So she's drinking 3 liters of vodka an afternoon. Or you're using the sort of same amount of alcohol, but not getting an effect from it. And then finally, either you're having withdrawal symptoms or you're using alcohol to relieve or avoid withdrawal. So that's the classic example of that, is the sort of morning eye opener. It's also been described as the 4 C's of craving, loss of control, a compulsion to use, and a use despite consequences. Now, what do we understand about AUD from kind of a contemporary perspective? And at this juncture, I think people would be very comfortable in the kind of psychiatry and addictions world in really seeing addiction as a primary chronic disease of the brain, where the neural circuitry that's related to reward, motivation, memory are dysfunctional. And that dysfunction in those neural circuits then leads to characteristic biological, psychological, and social manifestations. And that in turn is reflected in an individual pathologically either pursuing reward and or relief through substance use. Alcohol impacts multiple motivational mechanisms in the brain, and it progresses, and I'll show you a slide in a minute, from positive reinforcement, like, wow, that feels good, to later in the course of drinking, it's not about, wow, that feels good, but phew, I don't feel so bad, because there has been so much change in the neural circuitry and adaptation in the neural circuitry and increased distress in response to stressful symptoms, so that ongoing alcohol use really dysregulates brain reward and stress systems and becomes very problematic. It's no longer a matter of choice in using. We always have to show a good brain picture, and so this really shows these sort of three parts of alcohol use disorder. So there's a binge phase, an intoxication phase, and I'll show you in a minute a slide that shows how these change. But initially, this is pleasurable. This is the motivation. But over time, and with each cycle of drinking, there's also sort of withdrawal, and these are the structures. And then there's also this preoccupation and anticipation with when can I get my next drink. And then these start to change stress and reward cycles, and also the response to the drug or alcohol by causing adaptations at the molecular level in the brain cells, the way brain cells talk to each other through synapses, and then in these larger neural circuits. So at the start, when you're new to alcohol, whoa, it feels good. But over time, as those neural intoxication goes, it goes from wow to oh, I just feel better because I don't feel so shitty. The withdrawal effects, which are very mild, maybe I'm just a little more less energetic or a little fatigued the next day, go on to the point where I'm distressed, anxious, and my stress tolerance is much less. And I go from, man, it'd be nice to have a cold beer on this hot day, to I'm obsessing and planning and figuring out how I can get to the LCBO and how I can hide my bottles. And all of these are a result of brain adaptations, and simply removing the alcohol doesn't immediately bring about a change. So why does alcohol use matter? Well, we heard I stole Prosanto's slide. I told him I was going to borrow it, because again, if we look here, if you severely relapse and you have alcoholic cirrhosis, look at your survival out here at 15 years is like less than 25% compared to if you haven't. So it really is important from that standpoint. There are a variety of different pathways also it's important for you to know in terms of people resuming alcohol use post-transplant. So, ideally, people maintain abstinence, and we'll talk about ways that we try to help them to do that. There are some people who will have a slip or a lapse. Sometimes it's just, that alcohol is so cued to social events. Most often we see these around kind of the holiday season, New Year's, or a birthday, where it's just like, oh, I always have a glass of champagne on my birthday. I shouldn't now that I have a new liver. And people, kind of quickly get back to abstinence. But there are also folks who start drinking often within 3 to 5 months of transplant and slowly, steadily increase, or may start with a very heavy return to drinking. And that can happen as early as the first 2 months. And there are multiple impacts that are negative that come out of this. So it's very hard to attend to the regimen that you have been placed on by the transplant physicians. Are you going to remember to take your anti-rejection medications? You're more likely to develop fatty liver and cirrhosis and other health complications. So it's not good. I always tell patients that immunosuppressant drugs are wonderful because they help keep the new healthy liver happy. But the downside of them is that they also mean that your body is less able to respond to any kind of toxin exposure. And that means we have to do a bunch of lifestyle things. Have to stop drinking, stop smoking, and wear sunscreen. So what are the treatment options? Well, the first thing is that it's really important that people know that sustained alcohol use disorder remission is something that is measured in years. It's really interesting to me how it ever came up with the 6-month rule, and it was so arbitrary, because in naturalistic observational studies of people who use alcohol and run into troubles with it, it's very actually similar to what we would talk about for cancer remission, that you don't have an appreciable decrease in your risk of relapse until you're 5 years of abstinence. So 6 months doesn't cut it. So that also affects really how the field thinks about working with alcohol use disorder, and that cure itself is rare. And the goal instead is to be in remission. And again, that's, much like many types of cancer. So really, alcohol use disorder is seen as a chronic medical illness that's caused by a combination of biological, behavioral, psychological, and environmental factors. And what we really want to do is to try to ensure that our folks only have slips or lapses rather than a return to problematic drinking. So in predicting the risk of relapse, there are a couple of things that we try to do. We try to manage risk, and ideally, we want to have a relationship with the patient where we can identify slips early on, or they feel comfortable coming to tell us that they've had a slip, and that we can rapidly engage them with whatever treatment it is that they need in order to not go back to the problematic heavy alcohol use. It would be wonderful if there was a single scale that would help to do that, and different groups have tried to develop relapse prediction scales. So I've listed 3 of them here, and none of them are clearly superior at this juncture, and none of them have been accepted widespread. So what we do know, though, from those scale development studies and from a number of naturalistic observation studies of people using alcohol post-liver transplant, and from studies in the general population of alcohol use disorder, is that there are factors that predict relapse to heavy drinking post-transplant and to heavy drinking in general. So duration of heavy drinking. It's going to be easier for somebody who has 5 years of heavy drinking compared to somebody who has 40 years. The number of drinks per day, again, it's going to be easier for somebody who drinks a bottle of wine per day than it is for my poor lady who's drinking 3 liters of vodka a day. It's interesting, this may seem odd, but it's the number of prior alcohol inpatient rehabilitations is a negative prognostic factor. Initially, I thought, well, that's good. People go for treatment, but inpatient alcohol rehabilitation is the most intensive treatment that we have in the substance abuse field. And so if people are having that treatment and then continuing to have multiple recurrences of really severe alcohol use disorder, they're at very, very high risk for developing it again. There are many folks who come who just really don't have a motivation to stop drinking, either because they really like alcohol, they really like what it does for them, they don't have a life outside of alcohol. There could be lots of different reasons. But people who don't have motivation to change, we're going to have a hard time working with. There are lots of people who have very poor stress management skills. I think often as sort of highly functioning professionals, we don't remember that those things are on a bell curve, and if we're at the top, there are a bunch of people at the bottom. Many folks also have social activities that really revolve around alcohol. So if we hear about somebody's life and they literally do nothing that doesn't involve alcohol, it's going to be much harder for them to maintain abstinence post-transplant than people who are able to start to substitute. So, if you can go to the bar but always drink ginger ale, you're going to do better than if you just always go to the bar. If you decide you're not going to go to the bar anymore and you're going to see your friends hiking or watching sports, you're going to do better than the folks that have all of their socializing in an alcohol context. This is, I guess, politically correct language around lack of non-medical behavioral consequences, but that really means, is there somebody in your life who's going to really give you trouble if you start drinking again? So, and many of the folks that we see who come to potential liver transplant will have a partner or a child or a support person who says, if you start drinking again, I am out of here. And that is actually very helpful to people to help them keep on the straight and narrow. Psychiatric comorbidities become problematic in that they can help to produce these unpleasant emotional mental states that can lead to drinking, and because they can also interfere with judgment and with motivation. So the good news about it is that most psychiatric comorbidities can be treated, and so active treatment is part of our work. And then finally, if people are using multiple substances, that is also a negative prognostic factor. So the way we then try to do this is, we may use the scales, but it's really clinical assessments. And there's a need for professionals who have been trained in more than one area. So to really do these assessments well, so I started off on the mental health and psychosocial aspects of transplant and then have had to do more training around substance use. But you need somebody that has both of those sets of skills. Partly what we're just assessing is, can somebody form an alliance with us? Are they going to be able to work with us? I see somebody who we were really worried about this time last year, but I thought, he's a nice guy and he seems to be able to be kind of fun and playful with me. And we have been able to use that. And so even though he was at very high risk, he has done extraordinarily well, and I think is going to continue to. If people have insight into the functions that alcohol served, when people say, well, I don't know, or well, I just like the taste, much harder to work than somebody who's able to say, I had a really terrible post-traumatic experience and I need alcohol to help me with the feelings that come up. There's something that I can treat and work with. Comorbidities that elevate risk, motivation for change, what's internal, what's external, how do those go together or not? And what we really try to do is to aim for risk stratification and then identify what resources people need to try to give us a good outcome. Collateral is super important. The number of people who I've assessed who said, no, I stopped drinking several months ago, and then a very brave loved one or support person goes, honey, you had 2 shots of vodka before you came to see Dr. Abbey this morning. So that's really important. And then we also use biomarkers for alcohol use, so we can directly measure alcohol in breath, blood, or urine. There's an ethanol metabolite, ETG, and it's excreted in the urine for up to 3 days after alcohol consumption. So we use those. Now, in terms of treatment itself, there's pharmacologic or medication approaches and psychotherapeutic or talk approaches, and I'll just tell you quickly about those. Their first caveat is that there are limited studies in liver transplant. Both in the US and Canada, there are 3 drugs that are approved to treat alcohol use disorder. So there's the disulfiram, which is the old-fashioned antabuse, in which people really aren't using a lot. It impairs an enzyme that's needed to break down alcohol, and so it's to serve a deterrent function, that you become so physically ill and vomiting, and that hopefully that keeps you away from alcohol. But it also has concerns about hepatotoxicity and severe hemodynamic side effects and interaction with immunosuppressants. So very, very rarely used, and certainly not used in the pre-transplant population. Naltrexone or Revia, it works by blocking the pleasurable effects of alcohol. So instead of having fun with it, it's like having a glass of orange juice. And so there are some concerns about increased liver enzymes and rare hepatotoxicity. So it tends to be a second line treatment. And the one that mostly is prescribed in this population is acamprosate, also known by a trade name Campril. And it modifies that pathway around the negative feelings and the increased stress response to help tune that down, and then that hopefully leads to less drinking. There are a couple of off-label medications that are used, and baclofen is the only one that's been studied in cirrhosis. They're commonly known as anti-craving medications. The cost is about $6 to $10 a day. Ontario has full coverage through ODSB if you use a limited use code. The recommendation is that you take it every day, even if you are drinking, because it'll help to reduce the pleasurable impact of drinking. And typically people will use it for 6 to 12 months, but may use it longer, and you can safely discontinue it when there are no more cravings. People are confident that relapse isn't going to happen, that they've got strong supports in place, new coping skills, and they're not regularly seeing people who misuse alcohol. This is a review article that's done by my colleague Marie-Josée Lynch, who would have been with you today were it not for her new baby. And they have done a review of all the behavioral alcohol interventions for people with alcohol-related liver disease and transplantation. And their last sentence, however, given extremely limited research evaluating behavioral alcohol interventions among ALD patients, the efficacy of behavioral interventions for pre- and post-transplant alcohol relapse remains to be established. So what kind of things do people do? So there are studies and case reports of the first two are really around trying to build people's motivation. Cognitive behavior therapy and relapse prevention both use a kind of cognitive therapy approach that looks at thoughts and how those then impact feelings and behaviors and how you can replace unhelpful thoughts around alcohol use with more helpful ones. Relapse prevention particularly focuses on catching things early with the first slip or lapse, and then sort of social interventions. So I'd leave you with some take-home points that really alcohol use disorder is a brain-based chronic illness. You know, choice may be involved at the very start, but neurobiology quickly takes over. They've talked also about these disorders starting maybe with an impulse to drink, but then becoming compulsive, that you must do it because of how difficult the brain is for you. There are treatments that have demonstrated efficacy and effectiveness in the non-transplant population, although not everybody has helped, and risk stratification is important. There's no reason to think that they aren't going to work with transplant recipients, but we don't have a fulsome database yet. And really, to get optimal outcomes, it requires professional support. I was just looking before I got on at our data, and you saw from Prosanto's, that up to 20-25% of people are back to heavy alcohol use. In our very closely monitored, careful group, we've got about 4.6% right now. So, so there is the opportunity to really significantly help people and make this a viable treatment option and give them many, many years of happy and a good quality life.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Alyssa Tomkins. She's a partner at PartnerCaza Saikaley LLP. Alyssa.
Thanks, Vanessa. Just going to share my screen. So my presentation is going to deal with legal challenges to all of what you've just heard. In particular, the applicability of human rights laws under the Charter and the Ontario Human Rights Code. I guess it ends up being the BC Human Rights Code, now that I think about it. Okay, let's move this along. So my presentation, I'm going to briefly discuss the principles to be balanced and the restrictions on persons suffering from AUD. My co-panelists have done a great job and undoubtedly a more medically accurate description of these. And then I'm going to discuss charter challenges, challenges to policies versus challenges to individual decisions that where you're just challenging, one person being rejected. In particular, I'll focus on the so-called Selkirk litigation and the Williams litigation, both of which were before the Superior Court in Ontario. I was counsel in the Williams litigation. I'll also touch on human rights challenges, so that's before human rights tribunals. And in particular, I'll focus on the Dennis challenge. That's before the BC Human Rights Tribunal, which is why I made the comment about, I suppose, it being actually the BC Human Rights Code that was at issue. So as we've seen, I'm not sure if it was framed quite this way, but the principles that organ transplantation seek to balance are urgency, utility, and equity. So urgency, we heard quite a bit about, often expressed as a MELD score. We heard some more precisions that I won't get into since they seemed very medical in nature, but it's basically that the organ needs to go to the sickest patient. So that doesn't tend to be in dispute. Where things get a little more complicated are in relation to utility and equity. And this is where I would say there's an interaction between law, where we're really focused on equity, versus utility. So utility refers to organs going to the patients for whom patient transplant outcomes will be acceptable, recognizing, as has been discussed, organs are a scarce resource, and the need for organs vastly outstrips their availability. So I used as an example, because I'm most familiar with it, the UHN listing criteria. And these are the general criteria. Won't go through them in detail, but they apply to all patients. Where things get more complicated is, as we've discussed, patients suffering from, and it was generally referred to as ALD before, and now we're using more AUD, alcohol use disorder. I will say the two are not the same. For example, all patients who suffered from ALD were not necessarily alcoholics. And this becomes relevant in the legal context because the accepted ground for a challenge based on discrimination is alcoholism or the actual substance use disorder, whereas ALD, my understanding, is broader and could include someone who, had one bad night with, 2 40s of vodka or something, and that could cause injury to the liver, but they wouldn't necessarily suffer from alcohol use disorder. But so anyone who suffered from ALD, UHN applied a specific criteria, and it was under psychosocial considerations. And whereas general patients, any alcohol or drug misuse would be addressed on a case-by-case basis, for patients with alcohol-associated liver disease, inability to absolutely abstain from alcohol and or illicit drug use for 6 months. And that's, of course, the infamous 6-month rule. I've summarized it here, but I'm going to skip by it because we've already had an excellent, more detailed explanation as to the history. What I will say is it became quite clear in recent years that the 6-month rule was questionable and not evidence-based. And that's, of course, quite relevant from a legal standpoint, since the government is going to try to justify human rights breaches on the basis that they're justified and supported by evidence. So things got a bit complicated, let's say by at least 2015, 2016, because the consensus changed such that it was no longer viewed as supportable by medical evidence. And in fact, the word arbitrary was used in the disclosure in our case from TGLN, their own documents, and this is all in the public record, so you could go find it at the court. Their own documents referred to it as arbitrary. And at the time, they were continuing to enforce the rule, notwithstanding an internal acknowledgement that it was arbitrary. So from our perspective, that was quite problematic. The result of those types of observations, though, it wasn't ignored, it was still enforced, but they were trying to address the situation. And so as we've heard, they created what was called the pilot program, and that was put into force, or I think implemented in June 2018. And at the time, it was said to be a 3-year program. They got funding the first year, subsequently for the future years. Well, we'll get to the fact that it ends early. Equity, so that's where the lawyers come in. So, and medical ethics, I would say. I mean, these terms came from medical journals as opposed to legal journals, but we're obviously focused a great deal on equality, and as we'll see, also an absence of arbitrariness under Section 7 of the Charter. So equity entails that principles of liver transplantation allocation are applied similarly to all liver diseases. Where behaviors are responsible for the primary liver disease that requires transplant or for graft loss, such as non-adherence after transplant, allocation decisions should be made in a similar manner and not applied in a more stringent manner only to those with ALD or AH. And where this comes up, and it's arguments that we had been prepared to make in court, is comparison with Hep C, with NASH, which are arguably disorders caused by behavior as well. They were treated differently, and we would argue more generously than those persons who suffer from AUD. And where things get a little delicate is that there is acknowledgement in the literature that the previous approach was at least in part motivated by a view that persons suffering from alcoholism did it to themselves, were blameworthy, and it seemed particularly blameworthy even compared to these other behaviors that could result in liver problems. And obviously this is a very slippery slope to go down, because it goes beyond just livers. You know, you start getting into policing people's lifestyles, becomes relevant, you know, persons who are overweight, persons who smoke. It gets very delicate. But this is one that seemed to be wildly accepted. I mean, when I took on the legal challenge, my own family couldn't believe I was doing that, because they, you know, non-medical, non-legal folks, but they all had that instinct that, like, well, of course they should be treated differently. They did it to themselves. So I think we're finally reflecting now that AUD is a disease, and persons who suffer from it should not be subject to stigma or to blameworthiness. But that's sort of the ugly part of where these previous rules come from. So in terms of the charter, I'll do a high level overview. My understanding is most of the audience is not legal, so I'll go through it quickly just to try to explain. So section 15 of our charter deals with equality rights. And it's focused particularly on dignity in the analysis. But the first stage in the analysis is to determine whether on its face during its impact, and I'll come to that, the law creates a distinction based on an enumerated or analogous ground. So enumerated grounds are set out in section 15 of the charter, and I've listed them: race, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, sex, age, or mental or physical disability, or an analogous ground. And these are ones that the courts have read in, I would say. Sexual orientation. Now, I'll come to this, but alcoholism is an accepted disability. So we're actually dealing with an enumerated ground here. And the distinction alone isn't enough. The second part is to show that the distinction imposes a burden or denies a benefit in a manner that has the effect of reinforcing, perpetuating, or exacerbating a disadvantage, including historical disadvantage. And that reflects what I will say is substantive equality. So substantive equality is to be compared with formal equality, which means treating everyone equally, even if it results in unequal outcomes. So our courts have adopted substantive equality as a principle, and that gives rise to what we call adverse effect discrimination, which is where you treat a group of people equally on its face. It can have a disproportionate impact on a certain group that's linked to prohibitive grounds. So we'll come to that in relation to the Dennis challenge, which raised the ground of Indigenous heritage. The other area where the challenges have arisen is section 7. So section 7 of the charter protects life, liberty, and security of the person. That's again a two-step process. The first step is to show that there's a section 7 interest at stake. I note here that the courts have consistently found that the right to obtain medically necessary healthcare treatment, such as a liver transplant, is central to the interest protected by the section 7 guarantee. So there's no doubt section 7 is engaged, but then the question is whether the infringement is in accordance with the so-called principles of fundamental justice, and what the case law has held, that if a law is arbitrary, overbroad, or grossly disproportionate, it will not be in accordance with the principles of fundamental justice. So that's where what I was getting to the extent the denial of a liver transplant can be shown to be arbitrary, then it would be a breach of the charter. So that's where the evidence-based reasoning for denying the transplant becomes very relevant from a legal standpoint. And section 1, this is the justification by the government. So I'll say just as a general comment that section 1 is rarely successfully invoked where there's a section 7 challenge. And that's because when I was talking about the section 7 analysis, the question of arbitrariness already came up. It's already been balanced within section 7. So it has to be quite egregious for there to be a breach of section 7 that can somehow be justified. So when I'm talking about section 1 here, it would be really in relation to a section 15 challenge, the equality provision. And Section 1 is sort of a unique construct of our Canadian Charter, allows the government to demonstrate or justify the breach. And this is, again, gets very interesting where, as I say, we're balancing equity with utility. So some of the utility-oriented considerations, like, justifying why persons with alcohol use disorder are treated differently would come into this. So again, this time we have a 3-step process. The first step is showing whether or not the government objective is pressing and substantial. That's usually not a high burden. Here, the question is whether the legislative objective is rationally connected to the limit the law imposes on the right at issue. It's called the rational connection. And then the third step, and usually it's the minimally impairing prong that I've highlighted there that is often the most challenging, is that you have to show, the government has to show that they are limiting the law as little as possible. So one, I'll briefly address this little procedural hiccup that we ran into, is that one has to decide whether you're going to challenge a policy or an individual decision. So a policy, you can do a standalone charter challenge. And the benefit to that from a legal standpoint is that while the applicant has the burden to show a breach of either Section 7 or Section 15, the burden shifts to the government to justify it. And from a very practical standpoint, having litigated one of these, the government has all the information. So it would be really hard to have the burden throughout because I just don't have the information. In the Williams case, I was acting for an individual who then passed away, then his mother, going up against TGLN and UHN. So they have all the studies, they have everything. So it's very hard if I have the burden. And that would happen if I were to proceed under what's called an application for judicial review. So that would be a decision to apply a policy to an individual. And I would have the burden throughout. And not only that, the government would get deference pursuant to a Supreme Court of Canada case called .A. They would get deference throughout. So I won't get into this case in great detail, but the government did bring a motion to attempt to convert my charter challenge into a judicial review expressly for the purpose of getting deference. The court denied that, and the citation is there. It's quite a technical legal procedural issue, so I'm not sure how much that will be of interest, but certainly as you can appreciate, it was very important for us to ensure that the burden was on the government to justify the policy, as opposed to for us to show an absence of arbitrariness, or for us to show arbitrariness as opposed to the government having to do so. So I'll just touch on Dennis because I want to do that before I get to Selkirk and Williams. Just in the interest of time, I want to make sure I hit this. So the Dennis challenge, so a human rights challenge, it's slightly different lingo than Section 15 of the Charter, but it's the same idea, discrimination based on prohibited grounds. And I'll summarize Dennis. Basically, Mr. Dennis was a 44-year-old father of 5 from a First Nation in British Columbia. He filed a human rights complaint in British Columbia over the 6-month rule. And this ended up being a misunderstanding. And in fact, the 6-month rule had already been abandoned. So the person who spoke, Dr. Eric Yoshida, I must say, I'll just talk without, but so Dr. Yoshida was my expert in the Williams challenge. So Dr. Yoshida was no fan of the 6-month rule. When we retained him, it was being applied at his center, but that did change during the course of our litigation. But something I've observed is that sometimes the changes happen at the top and they don't necessarily get down. Not that long ago, we were contacted by someone in Ontario, and as we'll see, the 6-month rule has been abandoned, but a hospital, and I won't name them, was still applying it. We wrote them a letter, said, no, pilot program. So our client was quickly referred to the pilot program, but sometimes the communication is still not perfect. And it seems that Mr. Dennis's case arose in that context. So my slide skipped ahead, but unfortunately, Mr. Dennis passed away. And when I get to Mark Williams, I'll explain he passed away as well. As common problem in these types of challenges is the persons who are challenging it are very, very ill. So unfortunately, Mr. Dennis passed away, but the challenge has been continued by the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, and they filed a challenge. Mr. Dennis's challenge was unfortunately declared moot by the tribunal, and his case was struck. But the UBCIC is continuing it, and what's of interest here is their challenge is a little different than the other ones I'm aware of, because they're talking specifically about what I referred to as adverse effects discrimination. So they're saying that the abstinence policy that has been ended, but they're still bringing the complaint based on the impact that it had specifically on Indigenous persons. So they're saying, even though the policies applied equally to everybody, Indigenous people are going to suffer more because of their historically high rates of alcoholism. So that's an example of adverse effects discrimination. I haven't heard anything further about where the challenge is at. There do not appear to be decisions posted on the BC Tribunal website, but that challenge does appear to be proceeding. And they may have a possibility of getting damages, but by all accounts, the actual abstinence policy, the so-called 6-month rule, has been abandoned. So there is a mootness issue potentially there. So I'll turn briefly now. I'm cognizant of my time. There's the 2 cases that proceeded in Ontario Superior Court, Selkirk and Williams. So Selkirk, the plaintiff or the applicant was Deborah Selkirk, very active in this area, self-represented litigant. Her husband, Mark Selkirk, was denied a liver transplant in 2010 on the basis of the 6-month rule. So that case was initiated in 2015, I believe. And it was put on hold because the pilot program was instituted, and there was a question of whether the pilot program would address Ms. Selkirk's concerns. In the end, that was not the case. And then the Williams case is the one that I was involved with. Mr. Williams retained us in April 2019. By that point, he had already been admitted to the Juravinski Hospital in Hamilton. As you can see from his MELD score, he was very, very ill when we took him on. This is a case again where Mr. Williams had been advised that he was excluded by the 6-month rule alone. And in fact, his mother, pursuant to the advice of Deborah Selkirk, actually had to get him assessed under the pilot criteria. It was not offered to him by the hospital. So he was assessed and he was refused for 3 reasons. History of continued alcohol use following diagnosis of alcohol-associated liver disease, history of ongoing alcohol use despite negative or psychosocial consequences, limited insight into the effects of alcohol. And we never got to argue this in court because it ended up settling. But our position was that those 3 reasons are absolutely endemic of AUD. So it makes it discriminatory on its face. Not only that, the previous version of the pilot criteria was exclusionary. If you had these, and as I said, these are all things that certainly the American Association for the Study of Liver Disease, their criteria for AUD include all of these things. So basically, if you had AUD, you were never going to qualify for the pilot program. So that was the basis for our challenge, but there were some modifications, so we didn't end up going to court. So there was an order that Williams and Selkirk be heard together, many, many expert reports, cross-examinations, March 2020, COVID in the middle of the crosses, had to adjourn them till September. I would say the consensus of the experts, there was little attempt to defend the 6-month rule. We were still challenging it because TGLN and UHN had taken the position that the pilot program was not certain and that it might end. That effectively the 6-month rule could come back, that the pilot program was just a test. However, a month after the cross-examinations, when, by the way, we were told that there was no data yet for the pilot program because it was a 3-year program and that data had not been compiled yet when I saw production of it. Suddenly, we were told, in fact, the results were great and the pilot program was ending early. Good news, 6-month rule is gone. And the pilot criteria were also quietly modified so that no one factor became exclusionary. And as I said, that was actually the basis of our challenge. So I think for my client, who is now Mark Williams' mother, Lynn, she was disappointed that the matter would not be going to court because in a way that was important to her to vindicate Mark's name and how he had been treated. But it's obviously an excellent result for patients that we think is much more consistent with evidence. So the 6-month rule is gone. And we think that the pilot criteria, the way that they've been modified so as to be more fair is obviously hugely beneficial for it. It becomes a case-by-case assessment as opposed to, you have these criteria, which, as I said, are endemic to AUD, you're excluded. So hearing postponed to allow time for further discussions. And we actually had further discussions with UHN and TGLN, got some more changes, and we agreed to dismiss our application. The Selkirk case continued and the hearing proceeded in February 2021, that's a typo. And there has since been a decision and the application was dismissed. So basically, I'll skip through the procedural stuff in the interest of time, but basically no violation of Section 15, no violation of Section 7. And in fact, some of the things, so as a lawyer, you never know, like the changes made, were they perfect? No, but they were very good. And in fact, some of the things that the court relied on were exactly the things that we had tweaked. One of them, for example, is that the criteria used to exclude people where there had been an inability to follow the advice of health professionals. And one change that we specifically requested and got accepted was that had to be the case with the exception of in relation to alcohol use, because we said that compounded the other factors. That very frequently AUD patients are told to stop drinking and they don't. And we said that's already addressed in some of the other criteria. So let's take that out here and let's allow other potential failures to become relevant. So the court actually pointed to that as an example of why it wasn't arbitrary. The same here, the court specifically found, and I've highlighted, criteria is not a checklist. And they're meant to guide the transplant team, and it's multifactorial. So that, again, that was the critical factor for us in deciding to settle, was for us, the checklist was very unfair. When it became multidisciplinary, multifactorial, it was much more defensible. The court acknowledges criteria aren't perfect, but said it's not the role of the court to direct medical research. The sole question before the court is to answer whether there's a distinction that imposes a burden in an arbitrary or discriminatory manner. So that's that case. I won't go into Section 7 because it's less interesting. And if there's any questions, happy to answer them, but we have a sort of a temporary resolution on the legal front in relation to these issues.
Thank you, Alyssa. So I'm going to open it up to questions. Again, just encourage you to please put your questions in the Q&A. And thank you again to all of the panelists. So our first question, based on excellent clinical outcomes with 6 months abstinence, is it worth changing the rules for the small number of potential liver recipients? Would a case-by-case approach for the exceptions be a better way to go?
So I can take a stab at that. I think that's exactly what, well, in some ways, that's what the alternate pathway is. It really is a multidisciplinary evaluation of every case. It's not the application of a single rule. It will rule out people from liver transplantation. And Susan can speak to this. Of the number of patients who were screened under that pilot project, the number who went through to become eligible for and then ultimately were offered liver transplant and underwent liver transplantation, many of the patients who went through this process didn't make it all the way to liver transplant for a variety of reasons. So it's not opening up the floodgates, carte blanche to anybody with an alcohol use disorder to get a liver transplant. In some ways, the criteria are actually much more stringent than an arbitrary 6-month rule, which arguably is for many people not that hard to get to. It also is much more resource intensive on the part of the transplant teams in their evaluation, in the personnel with expertise in the treatment of addiction, providing support to the patients as they are going through the process of getting onto the wait list, but also providing that support after they've had a liver transplant in terms of relapse prevention and early treatment of recurrent disease. Just as we'd give them antivirals for hepatitis C, intervening on relapsed alcohol use so as to avoid that divergence of outcome many years later. And, as Susan referenced, the outcomes in terms of this very short term, obviously, are very good thus far. So, I think that we acknowledge that the 6-month rule can't be applied anymore. It is too arbitrary, but it is going to require more resources to do this well. And experts like Susan and like we have access to in Larry Hoffman here are not widespread. And this is an area of medical need now that we're going to have to find the resources for. Susan, I don't know if you have any additional comments on that.
I was going to say the other interesting issue is that because the 6-month rule is so widely known, now that we're applying this pathway to everybody, there are people who have been abstinent for 6 or 9 months and are like, well, I'm okay. And it's kind of, sorry, you're not, because, we think you've been abstinent for 6 months because you've just been sick as a dog and been in the ICU for 3 of them. We need to fully assess you and then may put conditions on around trying to mitigate the level of risk. But it's super time intensive, particularly on the psychosocial side of things. Probably would be maybe an hour and a half or 2 hours for a standard assessment before. These can be 4, 5, 6 hours, multiple attempts to try to contact people. So it's very challenging.
Yeah. Alyssa, anything to add, or I can go to the next question?
The only thing I would add is that what we did know about the pilot program was, I think there was 427 patients considered. I'm giving approximates. And then I think only 27 made it. And the question that I had asked that led to my request for disclosure was, did any of them have AUD? And they couldn't tell me. But that's one of the things that I'm still unclear on is, would someone with AUD ever get through? And I think that's something that, we'll find out in due course. Maybe we'll get disclosure of the results. No, but at the time, that was unclear to me.
Yeah, no, I think many of them do, but I think where I showed the severity specifier, I think mild AUD is just like, come on in. That's going to be easy to work with. Moderate AUD, we can manage. When it gets to the severe AUD end of the line, then you've got to weigh all those other factors up to see whether is this going to be something that, that we have at least a 50% probability of having a good outcome with.
Understood, yeah.
Okay, our next question is about stigma. So there's tremendous stigma associated with AUD, namely when we claim that it is a self-inflicted disease, and this is something that all of you touched on. How could we as a transplant community decrease the stigma and help our patients to have a fair access to transplantation? Prosanto, do you want to start, or maybe Susan?
I think this is. Go ahead.
Sorry.
I think just stigma is so challenging, right? And I think one of the big factors is that there is such a huge knowledge translation gap, right? So the addictions field has been on fire in the last 15 years, and the understanding of addictions has fundamentally changed. And that has not translated just into general psychiatry. Like when I started doing my training to be able to do this, I was like, whoa, I didn't know that stuff, right? Because it's all in subspecialty journals that you don't hear about. And so I do think there's this piece around really trying to get the word out and to talk to our patients and their families, but this is a chronic brain disorder, and that there are ways to treat it, and there are, that this should not be an automatic preclusion from transplantation, but there's a huge knowledge translation gap.
And the thing is that stigma extends far outside of medical community. I mean, that stigma is out in society, and even in the families of patients, the understanding that this is a disease and not a self-inflicted one is sometimes not there. So their support network sometimes isn't there for them because they perceive this as a self-inflicted thing, and the families and loved ones of patients with severe alcohol use disorder, they suffer tremendously as well. This is a disease that doesn't have one victim. It has the entire support network that it can take down with them, families and friends and all of this. So we have to address that stigma in that support network as well, and sometimes.
Yeah. Okay, next question. Questions have arisen around the extension of transplantation to various indications such as localized cancers or post-COVID lung damage when limited data is available. In thinking about eligibility for transplant, might it be illuminating or misleading to consider ALD or AUD alongside these other possible indications? And that's for all of the panelists.
I'm just going to read that.
I can say quickly from a legal standpoint that some of these other things don't have the historical disadvantage that substance abuse disorders have. So it would certainly be difficult for us as creative lawyers to craft claims to show that it's discriminatory. It would take some time to show, for example, that persons with COVID lung damage are somehow discriminated against. So I would say that would be a preliminary legal wrinkle, but I'll allow the doctors to talk about the clinical implications.
So I think one of the issues around that is that listing criteria also have to allow for innovation and for changing things we do. Post-COVID lung damage is a new thing. There is no data around it. And as long as we as a community commit to collecting the data and assessing the outcomes, then I think we are going to be, it'll be necessary for us to go into these areas. So I agree that I don't think it's quite exactly the same as a disease which we've known for a long time and have had a lot of data about. So I tend to go more on the illuminating, but I think it's also important that, on the misleading for that, Jed. But I think it's also important that whenever we do extend to a new indication, that we do so essentially as a research project, so that it is supervised just like the pilot project was, and we have an idea of what the outcomes are of our new indications.
Okay, from an anonymous attendee, who is doing this well globally? Are any centers, jurisdictions offering post-transplant maintenance programs? Do any of these involve caregiver support system? Does virtual care facilitate delivery? So lots of really interesting questions there.
Some very interesting questions. So I think there's recent and fairly broad acknowledgement that alcohol use disorder is treatable and that it requires follow-up and treatment. I'm not aware of anybody who's yet excelling in this area. I think that the pilot project is actually probably one of the world leaders in this. But certainly there are other transplant programs globally who have been doing this, and many who've actually been doing it in some fashion for some years, where they've accepted exceptional cases that didn't meet the 6-month rule and gotten them successfully through transplantation with more intensive follow-up than is offered to the standard transplant recipients. Susan, I don't know if you have thoughts of on the other programs that you know of that are doing this or
I
something
would say
similar.
it's much the same. I think that one of the challenges, particularly for the US system, is that it's much less common for the transplant center to kind of, hold the patient longitudinally, just because of the way the insurance goes, and so that they, get lost to follow up or don't get followed longitudinally. We're really at an advantage in Canada with our publicly funded healthcare system. I think we're going to really have some really pretty fabulous data to help inform the field. But I think there are groups. This is a sort of a common theme across the world now. People are really trying to come together and do it. It'd be better if we could agree on some standard approaches and measures and collect data in a similar way, but that may come.
Okay. Have recipients who received a liver transplant due to alcohol use required or received a second transplant? So very specific question.
Required, definitely. Received less frequently, because often the very reason that they become ineligible was failure to comply with a 6-month period of abstinence. So until fairly recently, they would have been excluded under that. And even under the pilot project kind of criteria, the new Trillium Gift of Life criteria, if this is an ultimate relapse or return to severe drinking, it's proof in some sense that you are not able to make it through.
Okay.
I think one of the other sort of real challenges, I mean, we have had some people who have gone through the 6-month pathway who have then, gone back to heavy drinking and have ended up in end-stage liver disease. I think really the challenge at the end of the day then is, Prosanto showed the slide with the number of people who are dying on the waiting list. And sometimes, when we've advocated for people, the response back is, okay, well, pick who's going to die instead, because there are not enough organs, and we have to recognize that reality and really try to make a good decision. But it's very tragic to see people that have, you've walked alongside through a difficult pre-transplant period, got their transplant, and then have really had significant problems. I would note, though, all of those folks have not gone through this alternative, more intensive support pathway.
From another, the anonymous attendees are giving us excellent questions here. There has been a negative perspective from the community about, quote unquote, from the bar straight to the UR, and that transplant institutions are not allocating these organs to appropriate recipients. What is the ethical responsibility to the donor families and community in general? So again, getting at this balance.
Well, I think that's exactly right, and part of the 6-month rule's origin was to address this perception, that if the community is assuming this is a self-inflicted disease and you're giving patients livers that they're just going to burn through, that this would actually potentially have a negative impact on as far-ranging as decreasing donation rates. If people perceive that the organs that are being donated are not being stewarded appropriately and directed appropriately, then this could have a severe impact on the whole donation and transplantation system, far beyond just liver transplantation. So we definitely have to fight that as a perception, and I think it is supremely important that we are always balancing the different indications and really doing this in a very clear and transparent way, with our allocation policies being dictated by need. So there's listing eligibility, and this differs from allocation. Listing eligibility is how you make it onto the wait list, and then allocation is how you prioritize the patients who are on that wait list. So I think there's 2 levels where you intervene on this.
Yeah.
It brings back education as well.
Mm-hmm.
That many of the reasons for the public, I refer to my parents, but it's not understanding that there's a disease here, that some of those previous restrictions were perhaps caused by the same type of stigmatization. So there's a continuing need for education in this regard. Obviously, there has to be some relevance. Like Deborah Selkirk and I used to have this debate, and what she wanted was basically that patients with ALD or AUD are treated the same as everybody else. And we always said it's never going to be that. Like, it is relevant. It's just, we want the relevance to be evidence-based and not based on pre-existing stigma or disadvantage.
And I think it's also really important to remember that some of, at this juncture, really, the people that get in through the ALD pathway protocol have been very extensively assessed, and sort of an expert's made a decision around the probability of a good outcome, and really trying to work with, I think particularly nursing staff and ICU staff. I think it can feel quite hopeless because they just see people cross-sectionally. They don't get to see how well things can potentially turn out. But sort of so many folks also have multiple disadvantages. They're socially marginalized. They've had, terrible adverse childhood experiences, adult experiences, PTSD, and we owe them really good care and good treatment. And with that, it's in some ways it's become the most fun part of my job, because I see these people who really, have been train wrecks for a number of years, and now with really good care and attention to their comorbidities and follow up, they're getting the lives that they've always wanted. It's really heartwarming.
So this next question sort of leads nicely from Alyssa's last comments about education and how these changes have been communicated to liver transplant candidates, so to a very specific community, even those without AUD. How have those communications been rolled out?
Susan, perhaps you could comment on how Trillium or how the pilot project was communicated to people. I think it was really not, my impression is that there hasn't been a public disclosure that we've changed the rules and billboards inviting people to apply, but rather that, the liver policies are, Trillium's liver policies are publicly available on the website, as are BC Transplants. And I don't think that people have gone out on a large scale public awareness campaign around this, and not even within the liver transplant community yet. I made reference to the leading practice that we're trying to put together, and I think that part of that process will be the knowledge translation bit afterwards, getting it out to all of the programs, and making sure that is well understood and integrated in everybody's practice.
I think our hepatologists have done a lot of work in terms of reaching out professionally to their colleagues around the province and being sure that people are up to date on things and understand that, just because they tick off the box alcohol, that doesn't mean say no. Get them referred in, let us have a look at them, let us see what we can do. But you're right, Heather, we haven't reached out to the public, and partly it's because it was really structured as a clinical research project. We didn't know whether we could do this, and so I think there has been a sense of really getting enough data to be able to speak confidently about it.
I believe I did one interview back in November with the Canadian Press about the formal abolition of the 6-month rule, but there's been much more interest in the past, and this hasn't really hit the media yet. Even the Selkirk case didn't hit the media the way it has in the past. So there's definitely some work to be done, because like I said, in almost all the cases I've dealt with, there's a miscommunication. And, we saw it in BC where they launched a challenge not knowing the policy had been abolished. I know the hepatologists are trying, but those in smaller centers are not always getting the message.
And that's also why we have to be really thankful to Prosanto, because he's sort of leading the charge on the development of the guidelines or statement, or I don't know, you could tell me what it's called. I always get the name wrong.
Not quite sure what we're going to call it yet. So.